All right. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Tom, with our virtual stage crew series we've been doing here. I think you're the 7th or 8th person we've had here, so it's been really great to have so many people share their time and talk with us. And if you want to start with just kind of a quick little bio and then just start talking about how you got into theater.
How did I get into theater? Well, I didn't do it in high school. I actually was a walk on in the senior play because they needed another body, and I walked on and walked off with no lines. But when I was thinking about college, I was kind of, what am I going to do? And at first I kind of thought about radio television, right? Or what was called radio television back then, broadcast. And I went, just for a lot of reasons, I went to a smaller state school in Texas, which did not have a serious broadcast program. So I thought, well, I'll just get into the theater department while I'm banging out all my other college stuff, all my other liberal arts requirements. And after doing that, and again, I didn't want to be a performer. I started building scenery and helping on the stage crew and the running crew and hanging lights and doing all that stuff. It just started being something I enjoyed doing. So I ended up getting a degree in technical theater. And then I know this will be alien to most of these kids, but then I got drafted.
Oh, man.
And ended up spending 3 years in the Army. And then when I got out, I went back to school. I was going to get a master's degree, again in technical theater. And my college roommate dropped out, or my college roommate heard me griping about, I'm tired of school. I've already done this once. I'm really bored with all this. And his cousin worked for a company in Dallas, Texas called Shoko.
Oh.
And Shoko was one of the big companies in the US that started catering to the rock and roll touring market. When such a thing as rock and roll bands started happening, and they started touring, and they needed bigger and bigger PA systems and bigger lighting systems, so that they could go to all these cities. And you weren't setting up in a theater; you were setting up in a hockey arena or a basketball court or in some big arena. And you needed giant PAs and giant lighting systems. Well, Shoko was one of the 2 or 3 companies in the U.S. that was doing that, and they were doing it for like serious bands. I'm talking about Genesis and Led Zeppelin and The Who and Linda Ronstadt and James Taylor and all the people that were touring then had their choice of 2 or 3 companies to rent PAs from and lighting systems from, and Shoko was one of them. So I went to work for Shoko. I was going to go to work with one tour and do one tour, maybe 2 tours, and see what that was like, and then go back to school.
Mm-hmm. So what year would that have been?
That was 1976. And I did a tour with a rock and roll band from England called Uriah Heep. And that was kind of fun, but it was a lot of hard work, and the music was okay, but not really my thing. And I was getting ready to go back to school, and the next tour that they asked me to go out on was Paul McCartney and Wings. So then I thought, well, I don't want to go back to school just yet. I need to do Paul McCartney and Wings. I need to do that. Plus, one of the main things about that is that Paul McCartney and Wings was, it was just a big giant tour and hugely popular. And I thought, wow, this is going to be awesome. So I decided not to go back to school, and I did that tour, and that ended up keeping me there doing a bunch of stuff for the next 3 or 4 years. And then, this is a long story. And then I was again, okay, I'm tired of this. I got to go back to school and finish that degree up.
Mm-hmm.
And the engineers at Shoko were working on a new little project where they were going to put they were going to build a new little custom lighting fixture with a color changer built into it. And it wasn't going to be like something you added on to an existing fixture. It was going to be it's a whole new little lighting fixture that changed colors and changed beam size, and it was going to have its own little controller. It wasn't going to run off a standard light board. And that was kind of interesting. And then almost at the last minute, they said, oh, by the way, if we add 2 more motors, this light will pan and tilt, and then it'll be a moving light. So would you like to stay and help us work on this new project? And then after that, you'll go out on the road with Genesis, with the band Genesis. So I thought, yeah, okay, I guess I won't go back to school one more time. And I was there when the whole Very Light project started. So I ended up staying there at Showco with the Very Light project, and then Very Light spun off to become its whole separate company, like a sister company to Showco. And I ended up staying there for like the next 20 years. At first I went out with tours, and then I went out and helped people start other tours. And then I got more into like the marketing end and the technical product direction end. But I ended up staying, being part of the Very Light company for a long time, for 20 years doing, and by that point it wasn't just rock and roll tours. It was big television events and you know, the Super Bowl halftime and Grand Opera and Broadway shows. And Moving Lights started out being a rock and roll thing, but they ended up being more of they're now a theater tool, just like everything else. So I was able to see a lot of that stuff happen. And so, like I said, I did that for a long time. And then in 2002, Very Light got sold and I got laid off. It was sold to a larger company with their own marketing department, and they said, we don't need you. And I said, okay, that's fine. And I went around looking for another job. And I thought basically about the only company that I want to work for other than Very Light is ETC in Wisconsin. And I already had friends that worked up here. I knew the owner because I'd met him at trade shows. And I just knew it was a nice place to work and a bunch of great people. So I made a couple of phone calls, and the next thing I knew, I was coming up here for an interview and finding out just how cold winters can be when you grew up in Texas. And so then I've now been at I've now been at ETC I was there for 17 years. And then partly because I'd already planned it and partly because of COVID, I ended up retiring last August.
Wow.
So now I'm like everybody else. I'm sitting around looking at YouTube videos and hanging out and waiting for things to clear up so I can go out and play again.
Right. I hear
so
you.
that's kind of how all that went down. That was kind of like the last 40 or 50 years.
Nice. That's cool. So did you go into Showco like knowing you were going to focus on lighting, or were you going in kind of like as a general kind of like production?
No, I was part of the lighting department. It was pretty like any other place. It's pretty hard and fast line between the lighting people and the sound people.
Okay.
I mean, like everything else, it kind of runs in parallel, but you know, the sound folks have their job and the lighting people have their job. So I went into the lighting department, and I had hung lights and done a lighting and focus and I mean, I have to say, even at that point, in the 70s, the college I was at did not have a computer board. It had a big giant auto transformer board. So I hadn't done any real lighting programming.
And when you say giant transformer board, like you're talking like a wall, right?
A wall of auto transformer dimmers and all those individual handles and a bunch of individual handles that you could lock onto bigger handles and do big cues. But it was, every dimmer circuit had a lever.
Yeah, I've
And
seen a few of those.
there wasn't any memory to that. I mean, you just basically wrote down all the cues, and on you had to keep up with your notes. And on
Yeah,
Q7, I've got to move this lever up 5 points and move that lever down all the way. And as soon as I'm done with that, I've got to run over and lift these two levers up and do
yeah.
that. I mean, and
It's like
you,
almost like being a flyman.
oh God, yeah, yeah, exactly. And it would take 2 or 3 people to run a show
Yeah,
because you
yeah.
needed more than two. You needed more than two hands to do a complicated tour.
I've seen a couple of those that are still kind of hanging out. That they're impressive pieces of equipment for sure.
And then, of course, like a lot of things, the rock and roll, the concert world got stuff first because they had more money. So I went, when I went to work for a concert lighting company, and they actually had a light board that talked remotely to a dimmer pack. More or less the way we do it now. A lot of different, it was 0 to 10 volts as opposed to DMX and all that, but you still had a way that with a board that I could sit on a table, run all of those dimmers. I didn't have to have, I didn't have to pull giant levers.
Mhm.
So I was a I was a roadie. I went out and hung lights and got them up and focused every day, and changed the gels and ran the wires and ran the power distribution systems and ran the headset systems and did everything you did to make a big rock and roll show happen on a basketball court or a hockey rink.
Yeah. So how many shows would you be guys doing in a week at that point? Would you be doing like a city every weekend pretty much, or
Oh no. Oh Zane. No, you would do 4 or 5 or 6
would do 4 or
cities
5?
in
I
a
wasn't
week.
sure on some of those
No,
bigger
you
tours
were doing
with that
overnighters.
much gear. It was all one-nighters.
You were getting in the early days, you actually drove yourself. So you were at 3 or 4 people in a station wagon or in a van. And if it had stayed that way, I would not have lasted because that is a rough
Yeah.
way to live. You're trying to sleep in a car seat, and then somebody wakes you up at 3 in the morning because it's your turn to drive. I did that for 1 or 2 tours, and after that, it was like I wouldn't have done that. But then you got into the era of crew buses. You actually had sleeper coaches where you had a bunk, and when you were done with you were done with the show, and you'd take a quick shower, and you'd be in your bunk by 1 o'clock in the morning, and then somebody would wake you up at 7:55 to go in the next city the next morning and go in and do it all over again. Um, so, smaller tours would do that for 3 or 4, 5, 6 weeks in a row. Bigger tours, when you get into something like Paul McCartney, you're doing 3 or 4 nights in the same city. You've got more days off. Then it goes from being a grind to a pretty neat way to live. You're you're a vagabond, but a it's a pretty high level of being a vagabond.
Yeah, right.
You're staying in hotels, and you've got, the catering's generally pretty good on the big tours. So it's a nice way to earn a living for a while anyway.
Nice. Um, that's cool. So when did you really, like, I know you've done a lot of theatrical lighting design too. So when did you kind of transfer into doing some design work as well?
Well, as of doing the concert part of it, because I was there, I learned how to run the first moving light console, the first moving light board.
What was that? I have no idea.
It
What
was a one of a kind prototype controller made for the very first prototype Vari-Light system.
Okay.
And by today's standards, it was pretty simplistic, but it still did a lot of things. They did a lot of things right. The idea of groups and palettes and the whole way that you talk to a moving light from a console was kind of developed on that board for the first time. It was a pretty neat thing to. I have to say, I was very fortunate and very lucky just to have been there to watch all that stuff happen. And the neat thing about my job was that because I was helping to train new operators and new programmers, when a Vari-Light system would get picked to do a grand opera, so I was there helping, not programming, but being there in the room, making sure everything went smoothly and kind of making the phone calls back to the shop. This isn't working right. We need to fix this and that kind of stuff. So I started working at that point back with other theater designers and talking to theater designers. And, um, this works as a rock and roll fixture, but why doesn't it work for you? Well, it's not smooth enough. It's not, the dimming isn't good enough. Uh, the colors, I don't need red, blue, and green very often. I need pinks and lavenders and straws and all the colors that theater designers use. So I was taking that information back to the designers to make each generation of next product better and better and be more usable, not only in concerts, but in theater and opera and television and all the other places.
Nice.
And to be honest, I didn't really get into a whole lot of theater design until I moved here to Madison and went to work for ETC and started doing a lot of community theater around town. And that was just that was just a hobby. I mean, that was just something. I mean, I'd done it in college and I had done similar things when I was doing rock and roll shows, but it was kind of neat to get back into theater and do plays. Um, and do musicals and do shows. And then, like I said, that was 17 years ago. So I've been doing that for 17 years around town, and I've done a few things in Milwaukee. And, but I worked professionally as a concert programmer, and I designed a couple of tours, but I didn't do any professional theater design professionally. I did most of that as on a community theater level here. And I did a few things where there was a design fee around here, but not that many.
Cool. So I guess for a lot of these folks probably haven't, like, they've probably been to some rock and roll shows, but I doubt they've really seen any of the behind the scenes on the rock and roll sort of setup. And like, how do these things really differ, and where do you see them being very similar, I guess? And have they kind of like, did they start out further apart and now everything's kind of crossing paths more, or do you see them diverging again?
No, yes to all the above. They are, I think one thing that most people, especially in the early days, would assume that a rock and roll light show was somebody sitting at a console and just throwing handles around and making stuff up as you went along. And in a lot of cases, that was true. I mean, you weren't working really from a cue sheet. You may have had some notes, verse 1, chorus, verse 2, chorus, guitar solo, verse 3, and drum solo and big, I mean, you may be working from notes, but you didn't have cues. You were just making it up. But pretty quickly, and especially when moving lights came along, a show was cued and pre-programmed the same way it is for a theater show. I mean, things were already determined in rehearsal, and you had a little, in some cases you had a lot of freedom to deviate from that, but still you went in every night with cues already written, and
Having
so
a
it
fairly
got
consistent set list from the band, and like
yeah, and of course that varies band by band. Some bands, you know, they know 90 songs and they're going to pick 15 of them to do tonight, and you don't know which 15 they are. Other bands, you start out the tour with a set list and you may add or subtract 1 or 2 songs, but it's going to stay the same way the entire 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or I mean, in some cases, 18 months of a tour. Um, the one of the big differences is when you take a show into, like when a rock and roll band comes into the Kohl Center here in Madison to do a show, they bring pretty much everything with them. The Kohl Center is a big giant concrete floor and a ceiling that you can hang stuff from, and a big electrical service on the wall. That's all the Kohl Center provides. Everything else comes off of those trucks. The staging, all of the power cables, all of the electrical distribution, all of the band instruments, all the scenery, all the lighting, all of the trussing that you hang the lights from. Every single thing comes off of that truck or those trucks. And Now this varies a fair amount these days, but for most of the history of rock and roll touring, it was a 1 day thing. I mean, you got off the truck, the riggers would come in at 6 o'clock in the morning and start hanging the electric motors that lifted everything in the air from the ceiling. And then the lighting crew and the sound crew would get in there at 8 o'clock in the morning. And by noon or 1 o'clock, it had to all be built and lifted up off the stage. Then the band crew comes in at noon and sets up all the band gear and any scenic pieces and any um, like staircases and all the stuff that the band runs around on. All that stuff gets set up in the afternoon. Um, and the sound people tune the PA and the lighting people focus the lights. And then at 5:30 or so, the band comes in and does a sound check. Um, I mean, when you're a musician, it's a big day when somebody else tunes your guitar for you, and you don't have to set up your own drum kit.
Yeah, right.
So the band roadies have set all that stuff. The band comes in at 5:30 or so, does a sound check, and then everybody has dinner, and they open the doors at 7:30, and at 8 o'clock the house lights go out, and you do a big show, and then the show's over at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Then it all happens in reverse. It all gets torn down that night. So you got there at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 11 o'clock, you're tearing it all down. And hopefully, if you're lucky, by 1 o'clock, it's all back in the trucks and you're on the bus and trying to get 4 or 5 hours sleep before you do it the next time. You know, if you're lucky, the next day is a day off and you get there at 10 in the morning and have a nice day off. Or if you're not lucky, then the next day at 7:55 in the morning, somebody's waking you up again to go inside again and do that whole entire 16, 17-hour process again. So that's kind of, in the theater, you don't do that generally. It's not quite that, because of union rules and because of just, I don't know, good sense. Most time in the theater, you only work 12-hour days and not 17 or 18-hour days. So, and you already have a stage and you already have pipes to hang stuff from, and you've already got an existing inventory of lights sometimes. So you kind of walk into a theater with a lot more already there than you do when you're doing a rock and roll show, and you have to bring every single piece of equipment in with you.
You're generally going to do a few more shows. You're going to do at least 3 or 4 shows as opposed to, sometimes you're getting to do a week sit down or whatever, like at the Civic Center or whatever.
Yeah, a smaller Broadway show might do occasionally, very rarely might do a 1 or 2 night stand, but mostly we'll do 3 or 4 nights. A bigger tours like a Hamilton or a Wicked or the Lion King and all that stuff, they'll go into a building and sit there for a month.
Yeah.
I mean, or in a city like Chicago, they'll do a permanent show and it may play for a couple of years. It's just like being on a New York Broadway stage. Or a smaller Broadway show, you might do 2 nights or 4 nights or 5 nights. And then you tear it all down and you've got a day or 2 to tear it all down. And then you've got 2 or 3 days off while the trucks go to the next city. And you've got a day or 2 to set up. Or anywhere or a show like Hamilton, you might have 4 or 5 or 6 days to set up. And then you might be there for a month. You might be there for 20 or 30 or 40 shows. Yeah. So that's all. Nice. And when you're in that, sorry, I'm jumping all over you here.
Oh, that's right.
When you're in that kind of situation, generally then you're playing by union rules, which are a good thing. They exist so that you're not doing 17-hour days.
Yeah.
And if you're an actor, there are things in there to protect you as far as the amount of time you can work. And if you're a stagehand, you're not out there doing dangerous work after being awake for 25 hours. You've got rules in place to make your life halfway tolerable.
Cool. So what were you doing at ETC for these past 17 years? I know you've changed a lot and there's been a lot of growth and change in the industry there. So I know there's a lot to talk about, but if you could kind of hit a few notes there and how you saw it change.
When I got hired, ETC had just built a moving light called Revolution. And Revolution was a moving light which was designed not to be a rock and roll light. It was not an exciting, um, all singing, all dancing, rock and roll type moving light. It was meant to be a theater fixture. And of course, I had a background in moving lights, so they hired me to kind of work on that project. And um, I did trade shows and talked to designers and was kind of the marketing face for that product. Um, and because I'd worked at Very Light and had kind of a background, people kind of knew that that's what I did. So hopefully I gave the product a little bit of credibility. And not too long after that, I became the fixtures product manager, which meant that I was not only responsible for the Revolution moving light product, but for all the lighting fixtures that ETC made, the Source 4 and the Source 4 PAR, um, and all of the products that came after that, all the different, I mean, you know, Source 4 started out as a theater light with 4 different lens barrels, but then it ended up with 15 or 20 different lens barrels and all the different versions and a discharge version for architectural use and all these different um, um, add additions to that product line. So I wasn't there when Source 4 got invented, but for about 10 years there, I was kind of responsible for the product as the product manager. And my job was to, one side of me had to look at outside into the world and say, how can we make this stuff better? And what else do you need? And then the other time I was looking back into the company and saying, this is what we need to do to make this better. And we've created a problem with this, and we need to fix that part of the problem. So that's kind of what a product manager does. And um, I did that for 10 or 11 years. And while toward the end of that, in the like 2009, 2010, right in that era, is when LEDs were starting to become serious.
Mhm.
Um, and ETC wasn't building any LED fixtures, but a lot of companies were. And a lot of companies were building. And again, it started out, it's kind of a parallel to everything else. It started out for the concert world, for the rock and roll world. Red, green, and blue LED fixtures to do big, bright colors for rock shows.
Mhm.
Um, and ETC looked at all that stuff and said, well, those are kind of neat, but they don't really do what a theater light needs to do. They don't make good pinks, and they don't make good lavenders, and they don't make the kind of subtle colors that you need to do a theater show. So we kind of stayed out of LEDs until we started seeing one company specifically that started doing LED lights, and they didn't use red, green, and blue LEDs. They used red, green, blue, cyan, um, all these other dark greens and ambers and all these other LED colors. And all of a sudden, we started seeing LED fixtures that could actually get really close to theater colors. And not only would they make a good red, green, and blue, but they would do it, they would light skin tones and costumes in a really good way. And that's when we decided, um, me working with all the other, the marketing people and all the engineers, were like, okay, we need to get into this. These are going to start working in our world. So we need to be part of this. So we started building, and I was there when the LED product stuff started. Um, and it was this point in time, after about a year or so of that I realized that I needed, this was going to be not just a few months of work. This was going to be another 10, 20 years. I mean, it's still happening.
Mhm.
10, 15 years later, LEDs are still changing and still improving. And so at some point in time, I thought I need to turn the product management job over to somebody who is, to be honest, younger and hipper and more, a little more technically minded than I was. So I kind of said, hey, let's get somebody else in here as the product manager. And I wanted to do more. Um, my, my job title was outreach and training. Um, but I ended up doing more marketing stuff and less fixtures, product management, less technical stuff. And that's what I did for the last 6 or 7 years that I was there.
Nice.
Um, and I did a lot of speaking. I did a lot of public speaking for schools and colleges and trade shows. I worked a lot of trade shows talking about LED fixtures, talking about how if you're a theater designer and you've seen LEDs do a terrible job of lighting people and lighting costumes and lighting seniors, well, hey, we've got this new thing here, which is not terrible. It's really good. And you need to try this in your next theater show. And so now we're seeing the results of all that. You're seeing more and more theater shows be lit with more and more LED fixtures and fewer fixtures that have a light bulb in them.
Um, in a job that's so big as like full product manager, how do you spend enough time with any of those individual products to like know how they're really working, and to bridge that gap between that looking out and looking back in on the company that you were kind of talking about? Like I feel like that would be difficult.
It is difficult, except that I was incredibly fortunate that the product line I was put in charge of was the Source 4 product line. And the Source 4 was an incredibly well-designed fixture, even from day one. And it needed some improvements, and it had a lot of evolutionary changes along time. But it started out being really well designed. So it wasn't like I started out with this nightmare thing that you had to make better. It was already really darn good when I started. So I was very, very fortunate. Um, um, that's, and again, I don't work for them anymore. So I can say anything I want to say. ETC was and still is a really good company. The great thing about ETC are the people that started it, and a lot of the people that work up there are still come from a theater background.
Mm-hmm.
Fred Foster, the guy that started the company, had an IA union card and was went to school in the theater department here at UW. So he came from a theater background. And a lot of the people that were hired to work in the manufacturing department and work in the marketing department and work in the engineering department, a lot of them came from an engineering background, but a lot of them also were hired because they had theater training. So ETC still does a really good job of knowing what a theater light needs to do and what a theater console needs to do and what a theater demo rack needs to do. They're pretty good at that stuff. So you start out from a pretty good position
Mm-hmm.
up there because the company itself really knows what it's doing. The other good thing about that is that when you're a company like ETC, we have an office in New York, and we have people who work for us and with us who they're not talking to people. Well, we are. We're talking to the assistant technical director at a junior college, but we're also talking to Broadway lighting designers,
Mm-hmm.
and we're also talking. They have kind of the inside track. So if you want to know what's going to work as a theater fixture, you're talking to people that do it for a living. You're talking to people that design Broadway shows, people that design big, huge television events. Um, if you want to talk about building the next generation of lighting console, you're talking for the people that program Broadway shows and program Super Bowl halftime shows and program Grand Opera. Um, so you start out on from a pretty good place as far as doing product research.
Yeah.
And we try to, I say the folks at ETC, that we try to get the engineers involved. The engineers get to sit in on those conversations, and the really successful engineers are not just people with their heads down doing calculations, but they're people that can they can sit behind a lighting designer at a tech table and watch them work and have a sense of how am I going to build a better lighting console? Or they go to a lighting setup, they go to a lighting hang, where you hang fixtures and wire them all up and plug them all in and get them all patched. How can I make that better? So it's not just, fortunately, it's not just the product manager having to do all that. It's
Yeah.
the whole company is involved.
Yeah.
Everybody in the process, does their best to understand, why am I building this lighting fixture?
Mm-hmm.
What does it need to do? So
cool. So that kind of skip around a little bit here, but like feel like we're already talking about like how the industry has changed and is changing. And so like where do you see that going even more so? Like the shift to LED is obviously like a big one. I think like seeing more projections integrate into like theatrical stuff and like the use of video. And I think the LED and the video is kind of merging with some of those displays as well. So I guess, do you see that just continuing forward? Do you see that kind of like coming back around a little bit? Like, pendulum always swings both ways on
yeah,
some of this stuff,
well, nothing will go away. Everything just gets added. I
Yeah.
mean, and you're exactly right. When I started in the 70s and 80s, there was a little bit of projection for the biggest rock and roll shows. If you're in an arena, the band, and you're sitting in one of the back seats, the band's already tiny. And then you take that same show and you move it into a football stadium, or, a big, like Miller Park and some huge baseball stadium, then the band, if you're way back in the cheap seats, the band is absolutely tiny. So you have to have projections. You have to have image magnification so you can see close-ups of the band, so that somebody that bought a ticket can actually see somebody's face.
Mm-hmm.
But that was all done with projectors and big projection screens. So most shows didn't use that. When that changed was, again, like you say, with LEDs, and you didn't have projectors anymore. You had LED video walls. So you didn't need big, huge, high-powered projectors. You could get as good a result by just hanging a video wall, and you plug it into some kind of media generator, and then you've got big, huge screens involved, and that's when video projection became just as important in some cases. Now, this varies tour by tour. In some cases, they don't use it at all. In other cases, they only use it to do so you can see band close-ups. But in other cases, the entire back of the stage is a giant video wall, and you're doing scenic projections and all that stuff with video. So that is a fourth thing. You've got band gear, you've got lights, you've got sound, and now you have video imaging as kind of a fourth department in doing a big rock and roll show. And obviously it sometimes it's relatively separate from lighting, and other times it's actually, lighting and video are completely integrated.
Mm-hmm.
The cueing is done. Sometimes it's the video controller cueing the light board, and sometimes it's the light board cueing the media server to control what's going on the video screens. So all that stuff is changing.
Yeah. It definitely seems where like that's a place where a lot of these kind of different disciplines are kind of meeting in the middle, and different genres like the rock and roll tours, the theatrical stuff, and like some of the film stuff is coming back into that too, and their use of like LED lighting with their projections, the integration thereof, and then like some of the like video game engines that are getting wrapped into that control too. I think it's really interesting to see how it's like really, it's always been a multimedia environment, but how the kind of fine lines seem to be blurring between all those disciplines.
It's pretty interesting. One of the things I always say when I'm talking to students is that, you decide you like this. You decide sitting in a dark theater for 12 hours a day is a good thing, and you want to be a part of it. But you think, I'm not a performer. I'm not an actor. I enjoy being part of the process, and I'm kind of technically minded. Um, and I want to do technical things because I'm good at it. But I also want to be part of the production thing. The idea of doing shows is attractive to me. I mean, right now, like you say, one of the things that ties all this stuff together is networking. The idea that everything is a computer, everything has intelligence. There are media servers, and there are nodes, and there are smart consoles talking to smart lights. And if you're good at all that stuff, you'll have a job. If you understand networking, if you understand how one intelligent computer talks to another intelligent computer, um, and multiply that times several hundred computers all on the same network talking to each other. If you can sort that stuff out, you'll have a gig because it's what makes it all work now. And
Mhm.
I'm not talking about just big rock and roll shows. I'm talking about like Broadway shows and more and more theater shows have networking. If you've ever listened, um, there are quite a few things online about the musical Hamilton and how all that stuff ties together, and how sometimes synthesizer things from the orchestra pit are cued from on stage things, and sometimes they're played by the player, and other times they're actually automated to the point where they're cued, um, because it's rap, because the words are coming so fast, because it's moving so quickly. A stage manager calling those cues would have a really hard time getting it right 6 nights a week.
Mhm.
But so a lot of that stuff is networked together, even in a Broadway show,
Yeah.
not just in a big rock and roll show. So if you want to be a part of this and you're technically minded, learn networking, learn about video walls, learn about that stuff, because it's a whole new thing.
Mhm.
That's assuming that we can get COVID out of the way and actually start doing it again.
Right.
That's
Yeah, so that kind of perfectly transitions there. I think you covered a chunk of it, but kind of any other advice you have for people kind of like on this kind of career path that like want to work in the like entertainment industry, whether it's lighting or sound, like kind of looking back on your career and how things both translate or have changed, and like if there's things you do differently or kind of recommend people kind of like really boxes they check on their path, you know?
um it's different for everyone. I would say that a lot of people I know got their start working for rental companies, whether it was Showco, that was already a big nationally known and even internationally known company that rented large lighting systems and large sound systems, and also provided the crews for those. Um, in the early days, especially of concert touring, a band, most bands didn't have their own lighting designer. They hired a rental company, and the lighting designer, somebody came along with it to run the lights. Um, Pretty quickly, the bigger bands realized if we want to have any kind of continuity, they then they ended up hiring their own lighting designers, and they were freelance people. Um, but a lot of them, even most of those people, got their start working for a rental company. So those companies still exist. One of the biggest ones in the country is about 100 miles away, right outside of Chicago. It's called Upstaging, and um, they do trucking and lighting for huge rock and roll shows. Um, they started out in Chicago, and now they're about 40 or 50 miles away they needed more and more room. And they're now in, I think, Sycamore, Wisconsin. So they're down there, Rockford, and south of that. They're almost on the border, but they're a Chicago-based company, and they're a nationally known touring company. There are companies on the West Coast, companies on the East Coast. So those are the folks that's kind of can be a start. Even if you're just a regional company, that's where you learn how to do lights for a rock and roll show. It's where you sit there whether you're doing a corporate event in a hotel ballroom or working with a little band in a club. Just do it.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of times you won't make any money, and if you make a little bit of money, the work is incredibly hard. There is nothing glamorous about, doing that stuff, but it's where you learn how all of it works. Um, Now, ETC, it's important to mention that they're not a production company. They're a manufacturing company, and they sell their equipment to production companies and rental companies. So, on the other hand, they hire a lot of people that are associated with that have a theater background and that want to take that training and put it into something else. I mean, the greatest thing you can do to work for ETC is to say, I have an engineering degree and a theater degree. That's like touchdown. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I always hate, people ask me, what about college? I think anybody ought to get a college degree. I think a
Mhm.
good liberal arts background is important. Um, Whether or not you should go on to get a Master of Fine Arts degree, an MFA degree, is a tough one. If you ever want to teach, if you ever want um, to be a traditional theater designer, an MFA is pretty darn important.
Mhm.
Um, Nobody's going to ask to see an MFA degree in the concert touring world. Um, it's a little less formal,
Mhm.
but you still have to have a huge background to work your way up in that system.
Yeah.
I think then it's more like baseball. It's like a minor league team and a single A and a double A and a triple A. And then, you start out working playing baseball for the Mallards. And then if you're lucky, you end up playing baseball for the Brewers. You work your way up.
Right.
And I think in a lot of ways, kind of the technical end of the production end of concert touring is kind of like that.
Mhm.
And you just kind of work your way up.
Nice.
I don't know if that helps. Like I said, no, there's no one size fits all answer to that. It's a tough thing.
Yeah, for sure. It's I know there are some like kind of more technical schools now that focus on this for people that really want to just like get out there and program if you're like know exactly where you want to go. But I think most people that we've talked to have been on board with the 4 year kind of like liberal arts education just to kind of like really round out your experience. Has been
If if you really are serious about it, one of the things to look at when you're evaluating a college is a school. I mean, the college is going to evaluate you, but you get to evaluate them too. You get to go in and visit all those different schools. I'm a I'm a senior. I'm getting ready to go into my senior year, and I'm going to start looking at schools. And I've done enough of this to know I would really like to get serious about stage lighting, or I would really like to get serious about um, sound production, audio engineering, sound design. Um, you look at the the different colleges have good programs. Some colleges have a pretty good lighting program, but may or may not do a very good job with sound production, and vice versa. It's part of what you do when you evaluate colleges. Are they going to be able to teach me anything? I mean, I want to get a liberal arts degree, and I need to do all that other stuff. But when it comes to sound and lighting, how much can these folks teach me? Um, so that's important. Um, Another thing that you can look for is, now this is kind of scary because you're getting into schools that cost a lot more money to go to, but a school like Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, or a school like um, like the NYU, New York University, or um, you know UCLA, the schools with seriously big lighting programs. The great thing about going to a school like that, if you can get in, and the scary part is if you can afford it, is those schools have networks, and they've been training people who have gone out and become professional lighting designers. I mean, several lighting designers on Broadway have degrees from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And so if you go to school in Carnegie Mellon, you've got the inside track to people that already do it for a living. You're going to go to New York and start trying to talk to people and start, waiting tables and doing what you do to get it to keep employed. But you're already going to have a phone number or two. You're going to have an introduction or two to lighting designers. So that's part of, schools that have really good theater departments also generally have
Really good
people
at
that
that.
are alumni that have gone on to do it for a living. So
Mhm.
you get a chance to hopefully take advantage of that and get an introduction to people that do it for a living.
Nice. Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Tom. One last question for you, kind of touching on our current state of affairs with the world and everything. Like, how do you see COVID kind of changing the industry? And is there anything that's come out of this that you think is going to kind of stick around no matter what?
I guess if you're gonna, the idea that, I started out really not, I saw a couple of things on Zoom type productions and thought they were interesting, and I was happy to, and I watched them just to support people that did them.
Mhm.
But I thought this is not the same as live theater. I've seen a couple of things that is still not the same as live theaters, but the idea of a virtual performance
Mhm.
that is sort of like a TV show or sort of like a movie, but still a little more live. I mean, there's something to that, and I think we may see more of that. But I still think people still want to sit in theaters and watch shows.
Yeah, for sure.
People still want to go. I I mean, from the start of phonograph records in 1910 or whenever that happened, you've been able to sit in your own house and listen to music for 100 years.
Mhm.
But it's still not the same. Even though you've been able to do that, still there are times when you want to get out and see live music.
Mhm.
Um, you've been able to watch stuff on television since the 1950s. And a lot of times that's okay, but you still want to go out and see shows.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I bet most people sitting here watching this have probably watched Hamilton on the Disney Plus channel,
Mhm.
and it is really good. And they did an amazing job of turning it into a video production. But I watched it. I haven't seen Hamilton live, and I watched it on Disney Plus, and I thought this is absolutely amazing. But it didn't make me think I'd seen the play.
Yeah.
My first thought was, I can't wait to go to a real live theater and see this thing for real.
Yeah.
Because as mighty as it is on a video screen, it's going to be even better when I'm sitting in a room watching,
Mhm.
in the room where it happened,
Yeah.
if you will. It's so I think, we're going to get back to live performances. It's kind of interesting and scary to think how long it's going to take, but we will return to a day, I think, when
Mhm.
people are going to sit in a, you know, anywhere from 150 to 10,000 strangers are going to sit in a room elbow to elbow and watch a big show.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm,
for sure. Well, here's hoping we get there sooner than later. So
Me too. Me too.
awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tom. I'll invite everybody back here and see if we have any questions. But really appreciate your time and thanks for talking with us.
I'm sure I put everybody to sleep, and you all have to wake up now and pretend you watched this thing.